Hey everybody, welcome back. Now we're in lecture 2 for chapter 20. So we're going to be talking about how blood flows through our blood vessels and what forces blood to flow through our blood vessels. So the movement of blood through our blood vessels is associated with the pressure with a pressure gradient. So blood flow is directly correlated with a pressure gradient. If you have a high pressure gradient, blood flows faster. If you have a lower pressure gradient, blood flows slower. And so the more blood that enters our heart, the more pressure we'll have, and the stronger our heart will actually beat. So blood pressure then is the force exerted by the blood on the walls of our blood vessels and of the chamber of our heart. It is inversely correlated with resistance, so anything that stops blood from flowing. Come on, there we go. So what is resistance? Anything that stops blood flow. Peripheral resistance is the opposition of flow of blood that is encountered in our vessels as blood moves from the heart to our blood vessels. There are three basic variables that can cause resistance: blood thickness or viscosity, the length of blood vessels, and the radius of blood vessels. So when you say the length of blood vessels, I always like to think about it as if you are running in a straight line, you can build up speed and you can really go fast. But as soon as you start to move around a corner, you have to slow down. That's the same with blood as it's flowing through a blood vessel. If the blood vessel is long, it can build up speed, it can flow faster, it can be stronger, you can have a higher blood pressure. But if you have to turn a corner to move into another area of the body, then you have to slow down, and that's going to decrease the pressure. Make sense? And then vessel radius. If you have a large radius, the radius is like the size of that lumen. You're looking at that lumen size. Radius is from the middle of that lumen to the edge of the lumen of a blood vessel. And if you have a large lumen, then you're going to have lower resistance. A lot more blood can flow through. But if that lumen is constricted, so something is causing blood vessels to constrict, that raises blood pressure so that blood can flow faster through, because it has to get through that smaller lumen. We need to have our blood pressure be maintained so that we can get nutrients to all of our tissues. But if it gets too high, it can actually cause damage. So we're always trying to maintain blood pressure. So how do we measure blood pressure? There are, we typically look at our arterial blood pressure. Arterial blood pressure is always going to be higher than venous blood pressure because it's closer to the heart. There's more pressure coming from the heart. Venous blood pressure has a lot less pressure than arterial. So when we look at arterial blood pressure, there are two major pressures that we are focusing on: systolic pressure, which is the pressure associated with ventricular systole or ventricular contraction. So it's that high number. And then we have diastolic pressure, which is the pressure of the ventricles during ventricular diastole or ventricular relaxation. And we read our blood pressure systole over diastole. So it's always systolic and then diastolic. Pulse pressure is the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressures. And then we can find the mean arterial pressure by looking at the average pressure of the blood in our arteries. or we find, I'm sorry, the mean arterial pressure is the average pressure of blood in our arteries, and we find it using an equation. Hold on. There we go. Using this equation. So mean arterial pressure is typically going to fall between 70 and 110. And we can use this equation. We take our diastolic blood pressure and we add that to systolic blood pressure minus the diastolic blood pressure divided by 3. So let's say our blood pressure is 120 over 80. 80 is the diastolic pressure, so that would be that first number. Then we take 120 minus 80 divided by 3. And so if we did this, add the 80, we would get 93.3, which falls between that 70 and 110. And so that would be the mean arterial blood pressure. Simple mathematical equation. I'm not a math person, but this isn't that hard to do. To read our blood pressure, we use a pressure cuff called a sphygmomanometer, and we hear certain sounds. So there's a lot of sound going through, but the first pressure sound that we really hear that's obvious is known as a Korsakoff sound. And so when we first hear it, that is when we mark that systolic pressure. And when we hear the last sound, then that's that diastolic pressure. So Korsakoff noises or sounds were identified by Nikolai Korsakoff. And so he's the one who developed this technique. And we've been using it for a long time. And we use, this is a, hold on, it should pop up. Maybe. There we go. We use a sphygmomanometer, and that's what that pressure cuff is right there, to identify these Korsakoff sounds. So I know that in many hospitals, they now have these pressure cuffs that you put on, and they're hooked up to computers that do all the work. But a lot of times, and in this class, you'll be using these sphygmomanometers with stethoscopes to identify blood pressures. So then where do we find our pulse? So the pulse points are regions of our arteries where we feel that blood pressure moving through them as they move through them. And so the most common pulse points are the radial pulse. Well, these are all common pulse points. The ones that we typically use in our class are the radial pulse points, the carotid pulse points, and sometimes even the popliteal pulse points. But that you can find pulse points throughout the body. These are just the most common ones. And of course, brachial pulse point for when you are taking a blood pressure. So venous return is the movement of blood from our capillaries back to our heart. And we have very low blood pressure, so we don't have those pulse points in our veins. Venous return is going to be facilitated by both skeletal muscle pumps and respiratory pumps. So remember, our veins have very little smooth muscle. They do have these valves that keep blood from moving from one region of the vein back away towards the capillaries. As blood is moving toward back or through our veins, these valves will open. And so you see here we have skeletal muscle on each side of the vein. When the skeletal muscle contracts, it causes the valve, the superior valve to open, and blood rushes out into the next region of the vein. And then when the blood vessel, or I won't say that, when the skeletal muscle relaxes, the valve closes back up. And so blood's not going to move from a more, from a closer to the heart region away towards the capillaries. It always moves in one direction from capillaries towards the heart. Skeletal muscle acts as a facilitator by contracting and relaxing. So the more skeletal muscle we use, the faster our blood returns. So think about when you exercise, you're using skeletal muscle more, and so blood is going to move more rapidly towards the heart. When you're not exercising, skeletal muscle is still working, but not as much, and so blood flows a lot slower back to the heart. The respiratory pump works the same way. So as blood moves into that thoracic cavity, every time we take a breath, we are increasing the pressure of that thoracic cavity. And that increased pressure puts pressure on those valves, on the veins, and valves open and blood flows towards the heart. As we relax that pressure in our thoracic cavity and exhale, then those valves can close again. And so here you can see the movement of the blood from one region of our vein to the next region of our vein. Same picture, it's just showing the movement, and I'm talking about the movement over here. These valves prevent the flow of blood backwards towards the capillaries, and of course the exercise is going to move blood faster to the heart. If you have if you have a long period of inactivity, that's going to cause blood to pool in your legs more. And this can lead to a lot of problems. So you've always heard, well, I don't know if you've always heard, but if you haven't heard, I'm telling you now, if you're on a long trip and say you're in a plane for more than 8 hours, the one thing that you're typically told is to get up and walk around, take a little lap around the plane just to get your muscles working to help blood flow, because if blood pools for a long period, it can cause problems. So what are some of these problems that we see? One problem that we see in veins is varicose veins. And so varicose veins are typically associated with blood vessels, superficial blood vessels, so they're the ones that are close to the surface, so you can see them, that are very dilated, that have valves that don't function properly, and this causes pooling of blood, which causes these bumps. Varicose veins are most common in the veins of our legs. And reasons for this are standing for long periods of time. So if you have a job where you're on your feet for 8 or more hours every day, that can cause varicose veins to occur. Genetics, so if your family, if your parents have varicose veins, you're more likely to have it. As you get older, you're more likely to you're more prone to varicose veins. If you are overweight or obese, or pregnancy can cause varicose veins. A common varicose vein that a lot of people end up having are called hemorrhoids. So hemorrhoids are varicose veins in the anal region, and they're associated with pressure of the abdominal cavity. So when you're pushing, really trying to force that poop out, say you haven't had enough, you haven't had enough fiber, and so it's harder to poop or something, that can lead to varicose veins. If you're pregnant and you go into labor, that pushing the baby out, that can actually lead to varicose veins. That's why a lot of times women end their pregnancy with varicose veins. Another disorder is called a deep vein thrombosis. So I mentioned that if blood pools for a long time, that can cause problems, and that's why, like, if you're in a plane for a long period of time, you need to get up and walk around, because if blood pools for a long time, it can actually lead to a thrombosis, which is a blood clot in an unbroken blood vessel. A deep vein thrombosis is very common in your calves. So if you are not moving, if you're sitting for a long period of time, that can actually lead to this problem. If you have heart disease, it can also lead to this problem. And what really causes the problem, or what really is going to be the major problem, if you have a thrombosis and it moves. So the thrombosis detaches from the blood vessel and it moves, it changes or it becomes an embolus. And an embolus can then move into our pulmonary system or into our carotid arteries, and it can lead to respiratory failure if it's in the pulmonary arteries. It can lead to a stroke if it moves into our brain or into the carotid arteries, and that can lead to death. So I'm going to stop here because we just finished another section, and we'll talk about capillary exchange in the next video. So you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.